Okay, so this next chapter then is on our test for anions. So I have summarized the 5 tests for anions that you're going to have on the Leaving Cert paper. You can see them all listed there. The first is the test for chloride ions. Then you've got the test for the sulfates and the sulfites, followed by the test for the carbonates and the hydrogen carbonates. Then the test for nitrates, and finally the test for phosphates then at the end. We're going to go through them one at a time. So let's start with the test for chloride ions. So in this test for chloride ions, here's the basic setup to remind you. You have your test tube with water, which is used as your solvent, and then into the water we put our source of Cl ions. So in this case it's sodium chloride or potassium chloride. Any salt with a chloride element in it is perfectly fine, and that would supply us with our Cl minus ions. Then once that's dissolved down fully, you're going to add, the first thing you're going to add, your first addition, is silver nitrate. We'll add ammonia later on, but let's start with the silver nitrate. So silver nitrate, you can see here, is AgNO3. So something then, when things are put into a solvent, when they're dissolved down, they generally break up into their ions. So in this particular example for NaCl, this is going to produce Na plus ions, and what we're interested in is the Cl minus ions. When you then add the silver nitrate, the AgNO3, this again will split and it will give us Ag plus ions. Now the Ag plus ions and the Cl minus ions will now react because they're oppositely charged, and that's going to give us AgCl. So this here is what's called silver chloride. Now remember that silver chloride can only be formed if there is actually chloride ions in the solution. The silver obviously comes from your silver nitrate that you've added, but the chloride can only be formed if there is some sort of salt in that water. And once you've got your silver chloride, this is your first step. Your second step then is the addition of ammonia. So why do we add the ammonia? Well, first of all, AgCl will have an arrow at the end of it like this. And what that arrow means is it's a precipitate, PPT. In other words, you get a cloudy substance. And when we add the ammonia, so in step 2, add ammonia, then the cloudy substance should disappear. So the cloudiness disappears. Now, as the cloudiness disappears, the only reason why it disappears is because there was silver chloride in it. And the reason why is silver chloride is soluble in ammonia. Okay, so the reason for that, you have to give the reason why the cloudiness disappears. Silver chloride, which is AgCl, is soluble in ammonia. So, you know, this wouldn't disappear if there was no chloride ions. And that's essentially that first experiment. Now, where this is actually used in real life, I was talking to a friend of mine last week, and he actually is an insurance assessor, and he specifically works with ships like the one that you can see here. And when cargo ships are out in the middle of the ocean, quite often they can hit a storm, and you get the resulting thing that you see here in the picture, where you've got all these containers that are knocked over. Some of them can get broken. Water comes over onto the deck, and the water then can get into the containers. As you see here. Now remember, it's seawater that's coming in. So the main constituent in seawater is NaCl, which is sodium chloride. So what this insurance assessor does is he goes in to see if it is seawater that has actually damaged the stuff that's inside these cargo containers, or if there was just a hole in it and rain got in. So he has to differentiate between seawater and rainwater. Now, of course, rainwater doesn't contain sodium chloride, but seawater does. So what he does is he goes onto the ships and he will make up his own little solution of sodium or silver nitrate, and he will go on and he will look for this cloudiness substance. He will take water samples and then he'll add ammonia to it. And that way he can prove that the stuff inside the cargo vessel was actually damaged by seawater and not rainwater or some other sort of damage. So basic chemistry there used in kind of everyday life. Let's move on to the next experiment. So let's continue with the next one, which is the test for sulfates and sulfites. So we can see here our sulfates is SO4 dye negative and your sulfites is SO3 dye negative. So the setup is very similar. On the left hand side we've got the test for sulfates, and you can see that we are down here with our sulfates, and on the right we've got our test for our sulfites, and the test is done the same in both test tubes. We have our sodium sulfate is going to give us our amount of sulfate ions that we need. We've dissolved it in water as we did in the previous experiment, and again you're going to have two additions. The first addition up here is going to be barium chloride, and then after that, once you get your cloudy appearance, you are then going to add HCl. So very, very similar to the first experiment. For the test for the sulfates, again it's exactly the same, except we've changed the chemical to sodium sulfate. Again, you could use potassium here either. So that supplies our sulfate ions. So let's have a look at what happens. So first of all, in this experiment, well, when you add your sodium sulfate into the water, it splits up and it gives you sodium ions, but it also gives you SO4 dye negative ions. And that's what we're interested in this. The sodium ions just stay in solution. Then when we add the barium chloride, when the barium chloride gets added in, the barium ion is Ba2 positive. Now, as you can see, the barium ions are going to be attracted and react with the sulfate ions because they have opposite charges. So you end up with a substance called barium sulfate, BaSO4, because the charges cancel each other out. And in BaSO4, this barium sulfate, this is also a precipitate. So you end up with a white cloudy substance. Again, that line there means precipitate. So once you have the white cloudy substance, that's fine. You do exactly the same thing on the other side with the sulfites. So your NaSO3 will produce, again, Na ions, which we're not interested in, and we produce SO3 dye negative ions, which is the sulfite ion. Again, when you add the BaCl2, that's going to produce Ba2 plus ions. And again, those two will react, Ba2 plus SO3 dye negative, and they will react to form BaSO3. And again, that's barium, and this time it's sulfite. This is also a precipitate. So this precipitate is going to be a white cloudy substance. So the problem with a white cloudy substance in one tube and the other tube is, how do you tell the difference between the two? If both of them are white cloudy substances, how do you know which one is the sulfate and which one is the sulfite? Well, that's where the next addition comes in, which is HCl. So we can see there the second addition is going to be HCl. So let's have a look at that. So the first reaction is going to be barium sulfate, which is BaSO4, and we're going to react that with HCl. Now, when you react barium sulfate and HCl, you get no reaction. No reaction occurs. And the reason for this is barium sulfate, this thing here, is insoluble in HCl, which basically means that the white cloudy substance doesn't dissolve, it stays cloudy. Whereas on the sulfite end of things, you have barium sulfite, BaSO3, plus HCl. When the two of those react, you end up with barium chloride. These do react. So you end up with BaCl2 as barium chloride. You're going to end up with some sulfur dioxide and some water then at the end. And the equation's not balanced, so you probably have to have a 2 in there. So when this is formed, the barium sulfite dissolves in the dilute HCl, or it actually reacts with the HCl, I suppose is another way you can say it. But when it reacts, the cloudiness disappears. So this here is soluble in HCl. So over here, if it's insoluble, cloudiness remains. And you will need all these details for your exam. You'll need the reactions, you'll need whether it's soluble, and the final conclusion about the cloudiness. Here, the cloudiness dissolves or disappears. So that's your test for sulfates and sulfites and how to distinguish between the two. Let's move on to the third one. Okay, so on this next one, we're going to test for the carbonate ions and the hydrogen carbonate ions. So I've drawn a quick diagram here of what's actually going to happen in this experiment. So in the left test tube, what we've got is we have a test tube containing hydrochloric acid and your carbonate ion or hydrogen carbonate, because the experiment works for both of them. So just for argument's sake, in this one, we're going to assume that we've put in a carbonate. Now, the carbonate generally is found in this, which is sodium carbonate, Na2CO3. You could have put in sodium hydrogen carbonate, which is NaHCO3 is the formula for that one. But let's concentrate on the carbonate. When the carbonate reacts with the acid HCl, you end up producing a gas, which is why this is closed. So you have a stopper in the test tube, and as the gas is produced, which is where the arrow is, the gas will pass up around the bend in the tube, and it will pass down into the lime water. Or the gas that's being produced is CO2, is carbon dioxide gas, when HCl reacts with a carbonate. The carbon dioxide then passes down through the tube, it passes into the lime water, and then it turns the lime water milky. So this turns milky. Because it turns milky, this is proof that carbon dioxide has been produced. So let's have a quick look at the reaction to see what's happening. So when the carbonate reacts with the acid being a proton donor, is producing H pluses. The carbonate, which is going to be our CO3 dinegative ion, again, we're only interested in the parts that actually react. So that's going to produce carbon dioxide and water. And it's the carbon dioxide then that turns the lime water milky. What can also happen is the fact that the lime water turns milky, and it shows that the gas is carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide can also react with the lime water to form something else, which is basically called chalk or limestone. So if you look at something like lime water, so lime water has a formula of CaOH2. So this is basically calcium hydroxide. So this is lime water, or calcium hydroxide. When it reacts with the carbon dioxide, you end up producing, let's see, CaCO3, and you will get some water as well. Now, in this CaCO3 is a precipitate. And this is basically limestone. And limestone is what we call chalk. So the precipitate is that white colour that you would get from limestone or chalk or lime inside in water. But the important part to note is this experiment will work with either carbonate or hydrogen carbonate. So you have the same results. And the result that we're interested in, is the production of CO2. Now, if both of them are producing the same thing, how do you distinguish between the two? How do we know which one's a carbonate and which one is a hydrogen carbonate if both of the results are the same? So what we do then is we actually take our solutions and we're going to add magnesium sulfate to it. So in this first experiment on the left, what we do is we take our solution with your carbonate ions that you get from sodium carbonate and you add magnesium sulfate. In the second experiment, you take your solution with hydrogen carbonate ions and you also react with magnesium sulfate. So let's have a look at what each one will give to this. So in the magnesium sulfate, this is going to produce Mg2+ ions. It'll also produce SO4 dinegative, but we're not interested in that at the moment. And then in the second one, this is going to produce CO3 dinegative ions. So of course, those two will react. Mg2+ plus CO3 dinegative is going to produce MgCO3, which is a precipitate, and this is insoluble. Okay, and on the other side, again, you're producing Mg2 pluses, and you're producing HCO3 single negatives is the ion for that. So when these two react, it's going to be Mg2 plus HCO3 negative. Now this will have to be 2 in order to produce MgHCO3 twice when you balance up the equation. And this substance is soluble. So basically, when you add your magnesium sulfate, you're going to get a precipitate here, which is a white cloudy substance. Whereas over here, there is no precipitate, and it's clear. And that's how you distinguish between the two. And that's the end of that experiment. Part 2 then for the next couple of experiments.